Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. All right. You have to be twice as loud for the people who left at lunch. So when I was growing up, I was raised by my single mom. And so I learned a bunch of things. But she always used to watch, the Hallmark movies and would read the books like the Chicken Noodle Soup for the Soul. You know those books? And so I feel like today is a chicken noodle soup for the justice practitioner's soul, hearing the first two panels and really thinking about the mission of justice broadly and inclusively. So good afternoon. On behalf of DCJS Commissioner Rossana Rosado, it's an honor to join you here today in New York City among our community of service providers, advocates, public servants, and thought leaders who know that justice must be more than a goal, it must be how we govern. DCJS is proud to practice what we preach. We help to convene, facilitate, and support all stakeholders from crime prevention all the way through to reentry. Our work and resources are only possible because of the unparalleled support from Governor Hochul and the state legislature, who have not just doubled, not just tripled, but quadrupled the DCJS budget since we got there in 2021. And we are out there pushing those dollars out the door to build safer and stronger communities, and we've seen progress as gun violence continues to plummet to record lows, and we see decreases in violent crime, particularly outside of New York City. I want to thank President Carol Mason and President Emeritus Jeremy Travis and the entire John Jay College team, with special gratitude to Mindy and to Erica, and all the speakers and moderators who are sharing their ideas and insights today. We meet at a time of deep contradiction. To some, this convening could be considered more of one that is in the crosshairs than the crossroads. While communities across this country have been working to redefine public safety through collaboration, prevention, and care, we are witnessing a troubling trend. The federal government is pulling back from the very values and supports that have made this progress possible. Federal programs that encourage partnerships between law enforcement and the community, investments that helped us understand the co-production of safety rather than simply enforcing law and order, as Andre talked about in the first panel, are being dismantled and defunded. Initiatives that expanded the definition of justice to include housing, healthcare, education, and economic opportunity are being sidelined in favor of more punitive, narrow frameworks that discount evidence, perpetrate harm, and erode individual and community well-being. This regression puts at risk a core insight that many of us in this room have fought to make central, that law and order without justice is not safety. That law and order without justice is not safety. That a temporarily safe community isn't necessarily a just one. When our institutions prioritize control over collaboration, we lose the chance to build legitimacy, trust, and long-term solutions that promote accountability and opportunity. And we must be clear, justice is not just what happens in a courtroom. It's not a disposition. It is and ought to be the operating principle of good government. Justice is the object and operating principle of government. It should inform how we design systems, how we invest public resources, and how we measure success. Justice, in its truest and fullest form, is preventative, participatory, and rooted in human dignity. Today's convening is not just a reflection of where we've been. That's the easy part. It's a call to resist retreat and recommit to our shared mission. It's a reminder that the most promising, inclusive visions of public safety are not behind us. No, they're not. They are ahead of us, but we have to choose to listen and fight for them. I will now turn the program over to Errol Lewis for the next panel on addressing disorder on the streets and public transit. Errol is a man who needs no introduction. He is a national media contributor to the likes of CNN and others, but he is most well known as the anchor of New York One, a cable news station right here in New York. He's been active in print and broadcast journalism since 1998, and I won't share where I was in 1998. It's great to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. Our next session is addressing disorder on the street and public transit. This panel will be moderated by Errol Lewis, journalist and host of New York One. He will guide the conversation with Jeffrey Brenner, CEO of the Jewish Board, Monica Brooker, Assistant Commissioner of the Behavioral Health Division at NYPD, Jeff Coots, Director of From Punishment to Public Health at John Jay College, Tom Harris, President of the Times Square Alliance, and Arvind Sooknanan, Member and Board Director at Fountain House. Thank you.
Hello. I'm very glad to be here. I'm Errol Lewis, the political anchor at Spectrum News New York One, and the host of Inside City Hall. And we certainly don't take your support for granted. I'm very glad to be part of this conversation. And as a brief reminder, we have 42 days until the Democratic primary for mayor of New York City. So this is a season when all of the discussions we're about, all of the conversation that we're about to have is extremely relevant and active. I'm going to talk with this panel for about 40 minutes, and then we'll invite you into the conversation as well with your questions. So the illustrious guests who are here on the stage with me, you have complete bios, I believe, in your packets, or you can find them online. But I just want to say briefly that Dr. Jeffrey Brenner is the CEO of the Jewish Board. They're involved in supportive housing, 1,200 units or so, I believe. Dr. Monica Brooker is in charge of the co-response division at the NYPD, which deals with law enforcement responses that are paired with therapeutic and social service supports, something that is very much needed in the city. Tom Harris is the president of the Times Square Alliance. Before that, he spent 23 years at the NYPD, and so he has seen how we deal with disorder in that particular part of the city from a lot of different angles. Arvind Sooknanan, as you heard, is a board member and a member of Fountain House, a very unique and interesting organization that I'm proud to have supported. I think I wrote them a check last year. And of course, Jeff Coots, who we're going to start with, is the director from Punishment to Public Health right here at John Jay College. We're going to jump right into a discussion about crime and disorder, which are often confused in the public mind, in the public discourse. There is an interesting and important relationship between those concepts, and we're going to tease out a lot of that. In fact, Mr. Coots, we hear a great deal about disorder and the perception of disorder on the streets and especially the subways. What is the data saying to you? We have two great reports, and I went through them until the numbers were swimming around in my head. But what do the data say about what's happening in our city now?
Yeah, thank you, Errol. I'm coming through to y'all? All right. Thank you all for joining me up here, and thank you to President Mason and former President Travis for kicking us off this morning. So being the John Jay person on the panel, to bring a bit of context to the reports that our colleagues from the Data Collaborative for Justice put out. And when we talk about disorder and try to frame conversations around disorder, the necessary question there is, what do we mean by that? And sometimes what we see that we mean by that is it's things that we see on our way to work that we don't particularly like. So we did a study with MOCJ about 8 years ago. The Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice asked us to go to the hotspots around the city where 311 calls were being reported, where people were seeing street homelessness populations in those places. So we went to Elmhurst, Seasmore Park. We went to Coney Island and Brighton Beach. We went to Rose Hill Park up on Fordham Road in the Bronx, and we went to Chelsea Park and Harlem River Corridor here in Manhattan. And we went out and we talked to these people where there were tens of thousands of calls to these places. I think our first finding was a lot of the people that were congregating there were there because they were connected or a service was nearby. There was a methadone clinic at Elmhurst that people were hanging out waiting for to open. There was a soup kitchen down by Chelsea Park that people were accessing. And so the reports that we get through 311, and just in April, there were 1.5 million calls to 311. You could text 311 as well. So there's a significant volume of calls that come through 311. And that manifestation of or people calling in what they view as disorder is one thing, and it's juxtaposed with when does that then I guess the idea is that too much disorder or a permissive attitude around disorder can create space for crime to occur. And so when do we see that transition, right? And so in 2024 we had 122,000 criminal cases arraigned in New York City. And we had 90,000 civil summonses passed out. That 90,000 civil summonses, if we look at the trend that we saw in those reports that we referenced, so there's a big trajectory from the early 90s down to about 2016 that we see significant gains in reducing crime and in making improvements in a number of other areas. And in 2019, we had 30,000 summonses. So pre-COVID, we were about 30,000. Last year, we tripled that number. About half of those summonses that are going out are for alcohol, open container. And so there are decisions that we make about how we enforce the conduct that we want to see on the streets. And I think that's part of the conversation that we're having here is what different strategies do we have? If we rely purely on punitive measures, we're going to get those the results that come from that. So what are some opportunities to take a multi-pronged approach to address some of the issues that we see on the streets?
Okay. So now, Tom Harris, dealing with the Times Square area, where so much of the conversation is about what people see, what they perceive as disorder, what they perceive as crime, and having your experience with a couple of decades under your belt with the NYPD, what's your sense of the connection here? I mean, you came up really in the stop and frisk era, or I should say the broken windows era, where the prevailing patrol doctrine of the NYPD was that you stop the disorder or you engage the disorder so that serious problems don't develop. But I know you have a sort of a broader perspective on that now.
Thank you. So it's hard for me to imagine, but I started over 40 years ago in law enforcement. So thank you for saying just a couple of decades. So when I started, I started in the Housing Police Department, which is now merged with the New York City Police Department. And the focus was mostly on taking reports. There wasn't this notion that if you addressed the disorder that existed, the crime would go down. And for the most part, the uniformed police officers took reports, and it was someone else's job to either suppress the crime, make the arrest, or take care of the disorder. They were more concerned with policing the police than policing the public. And that shifted, I guess, when Mayor Giuliani took over with Commissioner Bratton, where they viewed the police as preventing crime, reducing crime, and that became the mission, and that became the CompStat process. So that sort of, when you focus on numbers, you tend to just focus on numbers. And the stop, question, and frisk is one element where I think it was a good policy that could have good results, that they just made a numbers game, and that turned out really bad. So the result was that, and during that time, the police was seen as the solution for every problem that existed on the street, from the unhoused individuals to the criminals to the kids hanging out on the street. Then it was the police were the enemies after the George Floyd around the pandemic. And now, and it was everyone but the police should solve the problems. And that didn't work so well. We saw more disorder on the street. And I think now we're gravitating towards that collaborative approach with all of the agencies and the community working with the police department. What I would say is our future is, and how we maintain the order on the streets is going to rely on us having meaningful measures of success and holding the other agencies as accountable for some of the disorder as the police have been held accountable.
When you're passing through Times Square, what catches your eye that says to you, this isn't just, a little bit of wayward disorder. This is something that's actually a serious problem? Where and how would be an example of where you perceive disorder that could lead to something more serious?
So as a business improvement district now, we have four pillars, I guess, if you will: clean, safe, improve, promote. So I think when I see a challenge, it's when the behavior that I see and that we hear complaints about is awful but not unlawful. Prime example, smoking marijuana in public. That is legal now in New York State. I don't think most people know that. I don't think most people are ready to accept that. So New York State is really the only state where I could inject myself with a hypodermic needle. You could smoke a joint, but Errol, if you're sipping Chardonnay, you are the one who is in violation of the law. So I don't think that people understand that there's a certain level of disorder that we have just said was okay. And maybe it's time that we don't.
Right. So now, Arvind, Sooknanan, tell us about your experience with Fountain House. Describe what you do and where in Midtown the drop-in centers are.
Well, first, I have to say this chair feels a lot like the ones in my therapist's office. Very uncomfortable, but I guess that's the point. I've been a member of Fountain House, specifically our clubhouse in the South Bronx, for about 7 years now. And I've been on the board of directors of Fountain House since 2022. To say the very least, it has saved my life, then changed my life. It's no secret as well that New York City has the most psychiatrists in the country, has a variety of programs that are there to support people with serious mental illness, including day treatment programs, including partial hospitalization programs, outpatient clinics of all sorts, a variety of, what we would consider to be state-of-the-art psychiatric hospitals and psych wards. And I did all of that, and it didn't help. I had been hospitalized over 20 times in just the span of 4 years, and had tried everything under the sun, all the antipsychotics. I even did ECT. I saw a multitude of therapists and psychiatrists. I got all the second opinions you could think about. But what was so transformative for me was being able to walk into a setting in which I was accepted as I was, regardless if I was symptomatic or not. And on top of that, it wasn't failure focused. It was a completely voluntary community that I got to be a part of, and that people expected me to be there one day or one way or another. And if I wasn't there, people would reach out to see if I was okay. And it's also the clubhouse model, it's intentionally understaffed so that members, we call folks like myself living with serious mental illness, members, to promote a sense of belonging and ownership. It's intentionally understaffed. I'd like to think, based off of all the meetings I've been getting pulled into, I think even the organization's understaffed. But everything is done side by side with members and staff. People with serious mental illness have created this community for and by them. And having been a part of Fountain House, it's really has helped me in my own development. I've been able to graduate college after going to 2 other colleges and not getting any credits. Thank you. Leading Assemblywoman Rajkumar's campaign that made history in 2020, and now senior advisor to her current campaign for public advocate. And for the past year and a half, I've had the honor of working across the country to shape mental health policy. And all that to be said is so you ask what happens at the clubhouse. This is what happens. I still have symptoms. I still hear voices. I still have episodes of deep depression. I still have episodes of really high mania, and in which people can be fearful of me. But I think what makes a huge difference is that people know that there's Arvind inside of me, that I am far greater than whatever my symptoms might present, and that there is now this entire safety net. Not just my family is no more in tune. I have a whole community of people at Fountain House. My psychiatrist is connected. My therapist is connected. Everyone's now working together in a really comprehensive way to support me whenever I'm in crisis. And just imagine if more people across the city had that.
How was the clubhouse scene in the neighborhood where it's based in the South Bronx?
Clubhouse in the South Bronx, it's right at 149th Street and Walton Avenue. Okay. It's not as big or beautiful of a building as the one in 47th Street, but it definitely is just as powerful. A lot of members, that come to our clubhouse come actually directly from state hospitals, which is considered like where the most severe cases go. We also have a partnership with the Fortune Society in which we have been supporting folks that come from directly from Rikers Island and try to help place them in transitional housing and into the clubhouse community. And so that neighborhood on its own, if you walk around, I've lived in the Bronx all my life, people would say, don't go there, don't walk there at night. There's people that are injecting themselves or, that are homeless, and they're crazy, they can be violent. And I understand why people have that fear. But when you walk into a clubhouse, people are still symptomatic. And you see that all the time, but it doesn't mean recovery isn't happening. Mm-hmm. It's the model that allows for more people, the very people that you might see on the street, to actually, work on the things that they can do. And I think we need that more in different programs across the city.
Okay. So now, Dr. Brooker, you oversee the NYPD's co-response program, which tries to ensure that people in crisis are getting mental health support, as well as whatever law enforcement response might be required. Acquaint us with where we are with this, because we're several years now into what was at first seen as an experiment, but is becoming now more the norm for us.
The co-responder model larger is now the norm in terms of co-response, but it can be an EMT and a clinician. It can be law enforcement and a clinician. It can be a peer and a clinician. So there are multiple models. And I say that because we see that in New York City right now in the different boroughs, is we have all sorts of teams moving, providing all sorts of services. For co-response at NYPD, our threshold is really that the referral is coming in for someone who may not be eligible for other responses because they have this significant criminal justice history, or there, is some fear for the person calling or making a referral about, danger or violence, whatever that means. So it's unique in that way. One thing that we learned in co-response, we started in 2016, was the officers within the co-response team do not affect arrests, because we can't collapse that. We can't provide really good care and connect people to services if we are simultaneously putting handcuffs on them, and so we very quickly figured that out. Interesting now, having run this program for 4 years, it's like, okay, but what's the gap? Because the gap is that individual that does have a significant criminal justice history, that has a warrant out there hanging over their heads, but that also needs services. And so, that is quite the challenge. And I think other people on the panel will talk a little bit about that. The other thing that I want to say, first of all, thank you for everything that you said, is the realization that people are ready for help when they're ready for help. Sometimes that coincides with an emergency call for service to the police department. And when it does, that's when we want to mobilize the best resources. I'm sure there are people out here who are on mobile crisis teams and are familiar. I say when they're ready, because a large portion of mobile crisis response teams across the boroughs can only engage if it's voluntary. Meaning no matter how much you want to help that person, it's when they can say, I'm ready for that help. And then the next step is finding the good and the most appropriate service for them. That's the first part. Do I think that sometimes criminal behavior and mental illness merge? Absolutely. And from that, I say, for co-response, one of the things we've implemented is a triage level. Everything absolutely doesn't need a law enforcement response all the time. We all agree to that. That's whether it's an officer in the precinct or some of us on this stage. Not everything requires that. So, let's say it's a level 1. Do we want that person to get help? Absolutely. Is peer support and peer interaction the best way to do that most of the time? But then you have that incident where you really do have a high level of risk and maybe even a crime simultaneously. And I always mention that so that we click down and unfold all the incidents and things that we talk about. Because protecting mental health or engaging in mental health justice, dialogue, as the people who were on the other 2 panels so beautifully said, it's much more in the details of it. And if there's a point where there's neo-advocacy in crisis work, it's about understanding the details and staying away from using terms such as mental health or mental health crisis, because we really don't know what that means. That could be a crying spell, to something close to very assaultive. And so I hope I've told you a little bit about co-response and
Well,
my perspective.
tell us a little bit more about the triage. In particular, I wonder if you could say a word about the 988 system, the alternative to 911, which is intended to sort of from the very beginning maybe steer the city's response toward a therapeutic resolution.
100%. I think everyone should get a tattoo, 988. It is really the clearinghouse for us. Yes, it came out of, we want law enforcement out of the picture, but it really has turned into the place where you start when you have mental health issues, moving into mental health crisis, moving into mental health emergency. And so they can really mobilize anything from a mobile crisis team, counseling online, all the way to sending that call to 911 because there's a true emergency. So for the city, I know there's lots of awareness campaigns now as practitioners and providers and social organizers. 988 is about the best thing I think that we can do for community. I was saying that I'd like all the officers to have it on their vests so as they're moving out of people's houses. It's the last thing that people see. So utilizing that first is best, but that requires education of our communities.
I see. Now, Dr. Brenner, when it comes to supportive housing, this has been a part of the equation that has been in many ways neglected in New York, where there was a lot of talk and there was even some legislation around involuntary commitment of people who are unable to take care of themselves or might be presenting a threat to themselves or others. The question that almost never got asked is, okay, well, what happens after they're stabilized, after 48 or 72 hours? And the answer is people need access to supportive housing. So describe kind of what you all do and the challenge of creating enough supportive housing.
So we're one of the largest mental health and social service agencies in the city of New York and the state of New York. We have 1,200 units of supportive housing. That's about 1,400 clients. It's in both congregate models and scattered sites. So people can be living in independent apartments with a roommate, or they can be in one building that we own, receiving services in the building. These are beautiful models. You'll often have people come out of acute settings in a very acute situation, and a remarkable amount of healing occurs once you get people into a stable housing unit. They sleep better. They are able to engage in their own recovery. In long-term data and statistics that we have on the model, the biggest challenge that we've been having is 0.5%. It's a very small number, so less than 1%, 0.5% of our clients generate the incidents that occur in our buildings. And we've been having pretty significant safety issues, both for our staff severely injured, and clients severely injured as well. But it's not at all evenly distributed. So, there's an often statistic said that, most people with chronic mental illness are not violent. That's absolutely true. But I can tell you 100% of people who exhibit very significant threatening behavior, and I would say signaling, meaning that they're signaling to other clients and staff, are really worrisome. And the response, I see that as really someone exhibiting and ask for help. And the current system is not set up at all to help them. our supportive housing is not set up to help them, and the state and city structures are not set up to help them. So there have been very high-profile incidents that have been in the newspaper that many of you have seen. Our agency is large enough that we have been connected to some of those cases. So I've had a chance to read in great deal of detail all the case notes and understand the case history behind them. And the care that those folks are getting is appalling. It's highly fragmented, highly disorganized, and people are getting services from many, many, many different agencies and have signaled and given signals that they're not doing well for quite a while and have exhibited really disorganized, in some cases, violent behavior. And that has not resulted in them getting services in the right way, in the right location to head off those incidents. So a couple of years ago, we got all of the data from the Office of Mental Health, the state office, for every one of our clients. We have a lot of clients in all of our different programs. And the question I wanted to ask was, how many of our clients are getting care from all of the other agencies in the city, and how many of them are getting care from us? Because the consistent theme I've seen over and over and over for people who have hurt other New Yorkers is how fragmented their care is. And so we got all of the data for all of our clients and all of the services that the Office of Mental Health funds. They fund a lot of different services. And it turns out that the majority of our clients get care from 2, 3, 4 different agencies and services that we provide. And the more extreme their utilization of services, the more different agencies that they get services. So when we met with the Office of Mental Health, we put all this together, met with high up state officials and said, look, we've got this anecdotal data of these cases. We've got our own data of people who were generating significant incidents, hurting each other and hurting our staff. And now we've got your own data saying that the more symptoms you're exhibiting, the more different institutions you are touching. Why don't we bundle their care? And their response was that that's against federal law, that would be reducing people's choice. And it's just simply not true. You can have a bundle of care, meaning that you get your housing, your psychiatric services, your day program, your ACT team from one organization A, organization B, organization C. So you can have choice at that level. So I have found that it's a really big issue in New York. And New York spends a lot of money. We spend more per capita Medicaid than any other state in the country. And despite people feeling like there aren't enough services here, this is a very rich service environment. We're spending a lot of money. There are a lot of really talented people delivering a lot of services. But there's a small number, a couple of thousand people who are not getting the service level they need. And their outward manifestation of that is violent behavior. So
it's so frustrating to hear that, in part because for some of us, maybe some of our older people here today, when I have medical needs, they have this thing called My Chart, right? And people are nodding their heads because they know what I'm talking about. And on your phone, my primary care physician is at Mount Sinai. The cardiologist is at Cornell Weill. Another specialist is at NYU. They all see all of the notes.
Yes.
It includes health and hospitals. They can see where I got my COVID shot at Queens Hospital 5 years ago, and on and on and on. Why are we able to do that?
We have that. And the reason I was able to look and put the cases together I described was because we have those systems. So we have remarkable integrated electronic health exchanges here in New York. So you can see all the different visits people have had. The problem isn't care coordination, and the problem isn't data sharing. The problem is the care models are not very good. And very talented people delivering evidence-based models, but we need to bundle the models together. So right now, supportive housing, which is where most of these clients land long-term, have people making $20 an hour with very little training, staffing all of these models. And then the expectation is you're going to go out to a different location, to a day program, to a clubhouse, to see your psychiatrist. And we need to bring a lot of that, not for every client, but for this subset of really challenging folks, they need a completely different, fully integrated model where the staff on site are much better trained. They're not sharing rooms with other people, and there's a more sophisticated service package.
And of course, the other part of it is that is a little frustrating for the rest of us is when you say there's a limited universe. I mean, I've talked with the health commissioner and the other health commissioner and people in the NYPD, and what everyone seems to agree on, Department of Homeless Services, is that there's a finite,
Yes.
and for
There's
New
a-
York, relatively small universe of people who need this intensive care.
There's a few thousand people.
And you probably could know their names,
Yes.
right? So you
Yes.
know their names.
Yes.
You have their medical charts.
Yes.
We know where to find them.
Yes.
And yet somehow we're not quite able to give them the treatment that they need.
So let's abstract way out, because I'm a family doctor. I spent my career in the healthcare system. And if you have one diagnosis, we do a decent job. If you have two diagnoses, things break down. If you have 3 or 4 diagnoses, or you have a disability on top of age, on top of dementia, the whole system starts breaking down. I think that's what we're seeing, which is these systems were built for fairly simple problems. And, if you have both a severe mental illness and autism, or severe mental illness and you have intellectual and developmental delay, system, you fall between two different systems, you're not well cared for. So I think in a lot of instances, very large systems are good at the average person. And then when you fall out of the systems, they're not built to deal with you.
Very interesting. I wanted to ask Tom Harris and Arvind Sooknanan to tell us about the Times Square Coffee Stand. This is a joint initiative between the Times Square Alliance and Fountain House.
Sure, thanks. So I'll start and then you can fill in the blanks. Around the time of the pandemic, we saw that while everyone was sheltering in place, we saw a huge number of unsheltered people living on the streets of Times Square. Our numbers skyrocketed. So we started a pilot program with the Midtown Community Court, the Times Square Alliance, with Breaking Ground that does service and support for the unhoused. And then we needed a mental health component because we sensed that people were suffering with some forms of mental illness. So we partnered with Fountain House and we deployed peer navigators. Almost within 6 months, we reduced the unhoused population in Times Square from 31 to less than 10. And one of the strategies that we used was we put a recharge station in the center of Times Square with staffed by Fountain House. It's where we can direct people to get connected with any type of service. The Times Square Alliance has a social worker on staff. We also have an outreach coordinator. And what we'll do is during our midnight shift, we'll identify where people are sleeping. And then when the outreach director and the social worker come in, they'll connect with those individuals, direct them to the recharge station where a lot of them spend the day. And the hope is to build trust and connect them with services. So we've had it out there for a couple of years. Fountain House does a phenomenal job. It's one of our best partnerships. So jump in.
I also think that, what's so transformative and exciting about that model, the recharge station, as we like to call it, is that it just looks like any other, kiosk. And it's for anybody to come by. It's that they want to recharge their phones, get a cup of coffee, get some water, maybe chat with some folks that are there. It looks like any other spot. There's nothing mental illnessy about it, right? Or institutional about it. And I think the important reason why it's developed is because the other alternatives to getting to care has been jail, has been hospital, has been shelter. And I think that really is where the problem is. If we have more, places like the recharge station, like other entry points into getting care that's voluntary, that's dignified, I think, a lot more people will be open to getting care, especially if it looks like having coffee with Elmo and Superman. So
It always comes back to Elmo.
that's right.
Yeah. And so, I mean, Professor Coots, how do we reframe the conversation? I mean, you're talking about, from punishment to public health. That's not a journey or a mental leap or a policy transformation that New York is really accustomed to, even at this point.
But I think it is something that people recognize is needed for us to shift towards a more collaborative approach to addressing these components. As I mentioned earlier, when we leave things wholly to a police response, we tend not to like the outcome to that. If we're trying to address homelessness and the only response we're going to have is more foot patrol, we're not going to like the result that we have of that. And so, we're talking a bit about the subway. When we first launched From Punishment to Public Health, and we sent a letter to the police department, we said, hey, we have a whole host of agencies here looking to collaborate and bring a more collaborative response. Where would you like to focus first? We want to do something further upstream with a public health approach. An ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. Where can we be most effective on a pre-arrest? And they said, without question, we need your help in the subways. And so we went into Times Square. We went to the terminal stations where the trains end down in Lower Manhattan and in the Bronx and Queens. And we identified that there was an opportunity to hold the trains for about 10 to 15 minutes. And we got 2 transit patrol officers and 2 of the BRC homeless outreach workers, and they have the outreach contract for the subways, to go through all the trains and engage the people. And they had to get off the train so they could clean the trains. And so it gave us a chance to wake people up on the overnights. And we were able to, by engaging people with those services and offering them something that was not the typical offer of service, which is you can go to the 23rd Street intake shelter that's open at this time of night. We were able to have access to a drop-in center, and we could take them to that drop-in center. And we had to hire another security guard so we could access that drop-in center overnight. We were able to place as many people into that drop-in center as they were making arrests on a monthly basis. At the time, you could still arrest somebody for sleeping on the train, right? And then City Council changed that. So there were opportunities. And actually, when City Council changed it, we had already created the solution for the police department. We said, well, you just got to double down on this approach. More recently, as a number of subway incidents were in the news again, the state and the city collaborated to launch the Safe Option Support Program, or SOS. And this is something that got a lot of attention when it was first launched. And we had the good fortune of having Pam Mattel from CBC, who coordinates the project, come and speak at our December conference. And so they have 14 teams now that are working on the subways and in transit stations 24/7, 365 days a year. They've engaged 2,000 people in these services. They've placed 570 people from the subway system into permanent supportive housing. And they've placed another 1,700 of those people into shelter. So oftentimes it's, yes, you have to wait until they're ready for it, or the clients have to be willing and able to engage in these services. But sometimes it's also about tweaking what we're offering them. If we know that they're sheltering on the subway because it's warmer in the winter and it's cooler in the summer, the trains are air conditioned, right? The cars at least. And when we interviewed a lot of the people on the overnights, that was part of our role, was to go and engage some of the folks that and ask them why they were sheltering in the subways. Part of it was because the police were there. There was some safety in the presence of the police, even if there were also grumblings about how they would be woken up and told to move along. And to go back to the hotspot piece that I mentioned earlier, that was sometimes why they were congregating in certain areas. They were often kind of just adjacent to where there was a police presence, so they could use it if they needed it, because there's a lot of victimization of people who are, and that's one of the reasons they congregate in groups, is because there's safety in numbers. And so there's some really, I guess, rational things that lead into the way that people are behaving that way. And if we can understand their rationale and then engage them in a broader set of services, we can get more uptake of the services that we're offering.
Yeah, Dr. Brooker, I often wonder why in the public discussion about these issues, in my experience, I call them green room discussions, when we're not on camera and doing a formal interview, when you're backstage or you're talking to people, you realize everybody has someone in their family who's been, in contact with these systems, or who has had to deal with serious mental illness. And yet the conversation and a lot of the policy recommendations seem so harsh, as if you're dealing with a foreign population. How do we change the conversation so that people understand that it's like, look, this is like your uncle, your cousin, your parents eventually?
Yeah. I think we start I was like, I can hear myself. Um, I think, especially with police officers, we do use that approach, right? It's like count off by 10. And we talk about prevalence. And as police officers, they think that mental illness is rampant, but schizophrenia is 4%, and you're getting a small slice of 4%. So giving the statistical part, making sure and having a conversation with them that if you're talking about mental illness in a derogatory way, the chances are your partner in that car, is offended or can relate to that, and you're communicating that piece of it. And then the third piece with police officers is really highlighting for them what they already know. They often focus on the incident and how provocative it was and, hell's bells. But they also know that symptom curve. They know from the time they show up at the scene, from the time they transport that person to the hospital, it's a different individual, right? It's like, okay, something is going on in the house, it's major, and an hour later, this person is asking for a cup of water and how are things on the job? And making that explicit to their knowledge set about what symptoms look like and that it's not pervasive and everything all the time. And then when I'm doing training, I sometimes say, if you've got a child, and they're like, yes, throws temper tantrum, and they're like, no, never, he would never. And it's like, yeah, okay. But what the time limit is. And so there's a part of the science, there's a part of the clinical science that needs to go into police work about this isn't going to last forever. This is not dangerous forever. And then if you have people close to you, you know that intimately. There's an episode and then there's dinner, and that is the way we should approach things and make decision making because it's temporal for the most part. Does that answer that?
Yes, absolutely. And Dr. Brenner, I guess moving more toward a policy sort of question, the creation of supportive housing and its maintenance is one of the more expensive forms of affordable housing. What's your sense of how fast New York can ramp up and provide something approaching the level of supportive housing that is needed for the population we've been discussing?
I've been here 4.5 years running the organization, and I came in with the ambition to dramatically grow our footprint of supportive housing. And at this point, we've given RFPs back to the state, and we're freezing it. And it is incredibly hard it is an incredibly bureaucratic process to acquire buildings, to get them licensed. And I have not been able to keep my staff safe due to a very small number of clients for a whole variety of reasons. So I don't have a great story to tell, which is, as one of the largest agencies, we're not going to grow right now until some changes happen. I'll give you one small example. Our clients from day one are considered tenants and have all the rights of tenancy. But if they are exhibiting really extreme behavior, it can take me 4 years to get them evicted.
Whoa.
And we have been in housing court over and over and over. So I'll give you a real example. We had a client living with 2 other roommates stab his roommate and result in a severe injury, go to Rikers, and within about 3 months, we get a message from the public defender expecting us to take him back. And they were able to plead the case down and wanted to put him back in the same apartment with the guy he stabbed. Obviously, we said no. And from all the records we can see, he's still not doing well. And I have $20 an hour people in our building. He refuses to get treatment. I have no way to compel him to get treatment. So, we've hired a high-powered law firm to block him from coming back. And I'm now getting sued by the public defender because I'm discriminating against him. I would love to take care of him, but the way supportive housing is built in New York and the structures and the staffing, I'm not able to meet his needs safely without either having other clients hurt or staff hurt. So it's a really good example of what we're struggling with.
So, I mean, I've heard from many of the candidates for mayor, most of whom have held or are currently holding public office, that a housing first approach is the best way to deal with a lot of these.
Absolutely.
But it sounds like even housing first, I mean, there are some asterisks that come with that, right?
Yes.
Safe housing first,
Yes.
or therapeutic housing first. And
The data completely supports housing first, which is to say low barrier. There's no way that you can look at someone on the street corner and know how well they're going to do in supportive housing. You can take people right out of the hospital or right off the street, put them into a unit, and with really well-trained staff, they start to heal just from the ability to put their head down and sleep at night. If you take people and put them in a shelter, you know, if I put any of you in a large room with 40 other people, you wouldn't be able to sleep and you wouldn't do well. So take people who've had physical and sexual abuse in their lives, they may have had trauma in their lives, and they've got a mental illness, and put them in a big giant room, they do terribly. So shelters are a terrible place to put people. So housing first is absolutely the right evidence-based model. But what I'm talking about is 1% of 1% of 0.5%. It's a very small number of people, but because our rules and our structures are not making it easy to take care of them, you know, agencies like mine are pulling back because I can't keep my staff safe and I can't keep my other clients safe. There's a whole set of different things it doesn't make sense to talk about right now about acquiring a building and getting it licensed through OMH. Yeah. We were an inch at closing on a building that had 60 units in the Bronx, would have been a beautiful building, but there are just numerous bureaucratic barriers to acquiring buildings as well. So there's a lot of, when I read this stuff in the news, we're going to open up like 10,000 units.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, I could tell you story after story after story of like how impossible that is.
This is a real education for me because I'm not used to hearing it from the providers.
Right.
Right. I mean, what I'm used to hearing is that, well, it's $200,000 per unit, and
right.
you know, we don't have enough in the capital budget to do it, and
right.
it'll take 10 years to build it out. And you're saying
we were ready to go.
You're ready to go.
We were within a week of giving our signing an agreement to buy a building, and it had to do. This is a very stupid reason, but the Office of Mental Health's licensing requirement for congregate supportive housing is off of the International Fire Code, and New York doesn't comply with the International Fire Code. And they were telling us the building was 3/4 of the way done, that we were going to have to put an entire new staircase. And the code for supportive housing in New York State basically requires you to meet the level of a hospital or like a building like this, you know, with and not a residential level of fire code. Every room was sprinkled. It was a modern building, beautiful building. We'd have people living in those units now. And we had to go through a waiver process, and they said, no, not unless you spend another $2 million adding another stairwell to the building. We walked away from the deal. This kind of stuff happens over and over and over. The reasons that we don't take better care of people and have more units available are incredibly boring, bureaucratic reasons.
Okay. We are ready for some questions. Where are we? It's very bright here. I cannot see. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, great.
Yes.
Hi, thank you, everyone. This was super helpful. My name is Stephanie Green. My background, I spent 20 years in supportive housing, so I feel you, Dr. Brenner. My question is really about root cause analysis. So, you know, we know that there's been street homelessness for years and years and years, but I think we also all know, and most of that street homelessness is not dangerous, as we've discussed. And I think we also all know that something has shifted and that we see more street homelessness in the past few years with more visible mental illness and more substance abuse than we've ever seen. And I still don't really know why. And I'm curious what you all believe to be the root cause of that uptick in visible disorder.
I'm happy to jump
Sure.
in. So as a business improvement district, or really a neighborhood improvement district, we have the boots on the ground. So we interact with the unhoused folks on a daily basis. We view them as our stakeholders. We know their names. We know, for the most part, what the challenges that they face. And from our perspective, or from my perspective, the system is resource rich and accountability poor. We have this one lady, Jane, I'll call her Jane. She's living on 41st and 8th Avenue. 7 groups interact with her on a daily basis. They don't coordinate care with each other. She tells each group a different story, asks for something different from them. We have a bed, a single room bed in a supportive facility 4 blocks from where she is, but she says that she's very comfortable where she is. She does not want to go inside. So she's dying slowly on the street. When we spoke with the 7 agencies and we had them in a room, none of them felt that they had accountability for that person. And then by the end, everyone had accountability. But there was no clear-cut agency that was responsible for Jane's care. We sort of have adopted Jane. We talk to her a couple of times a day. But I think to Errol's point about your cousin or your uncle, they don't have family that helps them out. So in Times Square, we try to be that advocate for them. There are a lot of obstacles for service and connecting the dots with them.
Yeah, and I'll be a little bit provocative following the panels from the morning who were saying we need to do things differently. And I think our advocacy for individuals is everybody stay away, let them do their thing. This is about, self-empowerment and free will. And as a clinician, I subscribe to that. And then there's the limitation of decision-making because of your symptoms. And we haven't quite gotten to a good conversation about that piece. Are we protecting someone's rights to live in the middle of Times Square and refuse all services, or and say, listen, it's absolutely voluntary, whatever they want to do, especially when I think about the sentence of this person is dying slowly, and it's like, what is the next step to providing that care? Is there something between free will and compliance? Is there something about the best level of care and being intentional about it? Because I think right now we're just sort of in the wind, well, this person doesn't want to go. Understand. But then we mobilize all these resources, and we are all wondering, especially the clinicians, and especially in Times Square Initiative, but we can't get this person to care. And how do we do that in the current narrative? And I think as providers, we need to start thinking about, do we have some flexibility about moving people into treatment for a certain period of time until decision-making is good?
But I think I made this point earlier. I think if the only doors to getting care is jail, hospital, and a shelter, you're going to get the same outcomes every time. It doesn't matter how many outreach workers get to you. I mean, the typical response is, oh, this person needs to be hospitalized, or this, especially when the NYPD is called, they have 2 places that they could take someone like me, jail or the hospital. And more often than not, even if you go through those systems, you still end up back in square one. And even with all the resources, I'm glad you said it, where we are resource rich and accountability poor. With all the programs that are out there, there's so many gaps because of the level of bureaucracy that people like myself have to jump through simply to just get that first appointment. I mean, having Medicaid is its own barrier for people like myself in this city. Again, we have the most psychiatrists in the country. And for me, as someone that lives in the Bronx all my life, I would remember having to just travel an hour and a half on the subway into the city just to get a clinic that would, by chance, take Medicaid, because they would actually be able to have an appointment for me. A lot of these clinics across the city that do accept Medicaid, have extremely long waiting lists. So when we talk about, people with serious mental illness not being willing to get care, I think it's also part of it is there's so many hoops to jump through. The amount of bureaucracy that you have to deal with, plus hearing voices, plus going through whatever you're going through on your own, it's incredibly difficult. And I think so much of the policy is how can we, get people with serious mental illness to be hospitalized? But that's just one part of the issue. I think the real issue is that regardless of where you go right now, there's so many different gaps and no one wants to take accountability. No one wants to be held liable for me.
Does anyone on stage know of or would you like to offer for us a jurisdiction in the United States or elsewhere where they seem to be managing this kind of a situation better or more effectively, or in a way that we might learn something from? Finland, Copenhagen, Denver.
So I would look to Maricopa County in Arizona. They have really been at the forefront of creating peer-led outreach vans and drop-in centers. So there's an alternative, or there's a third option between the emergency room and the police precinct. They don't have much in the way of shelters out there. But that model was something that New York looked at and liked, and so they're starting to. I often think of these conversations in the timeline of task forces. So this was 2 task forces ago. We decided to fund crisis stabilization centers. And because that was so many years ago, now those are actually starting to open. It takes 3-4 years plus for us to decide we're going to fund this type of thing until the contracts come out or the RFPs come out, and then the application process goes through it and we get them open. So we are starting to realize some of those gains. And just to go back to the earlier piece about how we ended up here, I think we were already in a tough spot before COVID. And COVID really poured gasoline on the fire in terms of community mental health. And so when we talk about Medicaid and expansion states, and there's a lot of attention paid to expansion being that we're providing Medicaid to single childless adults. And that's, again, up for debate. But one of the other things that happened during the Affordable Care Act was that they set 10 essential services for Medicaid plans. If you're going to sell a Medicaid plan in a state, you have to have these 10 services. And that, for the first time, included and required Medicaid to pay for mental health services, substance use services, and pre- and postnatal care. So those were the 3 really expensive things that managed care plans didn't want to pay for. So although we have a medical system that has existed for decades, our public mental health system has really just started growing in the last 15 years. And New York was somewhat of an outlier where we spent a lot of state money on those things, but there were not a lot of federal resources provided towards this. And I think, one of my mentors described public mental health as like a pool with a current. And so some people, their mental health is pretty stable. They're in the shallow end of the pool. And there are some people that their mental health is not stable and they're in the deep end of the pool. But there's also the people in the middle, and there's a current pulling people down into the deep end. And that seemed to accelerate during COVID. And so we were already at a place where we didn't have enough appointments at the mental health facilities that existed, the newer community clinics that we were trying to direct people to that had only recently been funded by Medicaid. And then the demand just went through the roof. And so we're still struggling with a fairly nascent system that is not well tied together. And our demand for that, don't get me started on kids and cell phones, is really going up as well. And so I think that's a larger kind of grappling point for us.
Okay. I am getting the signal that we've reached the end of our time, but please join me in thanking this panel. I learned a lot today, and I hope you did too.